You have to see this video. It's going to change your life.
I knew this guy was going to be good, but he ripped these guys and you.
The way he put his point across was so powerful that you can't argue against it.
Some people are just so good at debating that they can convince you of almost anything. Mehdi Hasan is one of them. He even has a book, How to Win Any Argument, and when promoting it, appeared here to defend views he completely disagreed with for the sole purpose of showing us how to argue.
So I'm going to ask you to say, and you're going to have to argue the opposite.
Great.
In 60 seconds, that Donald Trump does not deserve a second term.
Are you kidding me?
2024.
Are you kidding me?
However, some years ago, he appeared in an Oxford Union debate defending the motion, Islam is a religion of peace. And it's here where I believe he made a very flawed argument. And more importantly, he, and almost all others, missed something absolutely crucial, as we shall get to.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Assalamu alaikum. Lovely to see you all here tonight. We are having a very entertaining night, are we not, with some very interesting things being said. From the other side of the house tonight, let me begin by saying, as a Muslim, as a representative of Islam, I would consider myself an ambassador for Islam, a believer in Islam, a follower of Islam and its prophet. So in that capacity, let me begin by apologizing to Anne-Marie for the Bali bombings. I apologize for the role of my religion and me and my people, for the killing of Theo van Gogh, for 7/7. Yes, that was all of us. That was Islam, that was Muslims, that was the Quran. I mean, astonishing claims to make in the very first speech tonight, on a day like today, where the Conservative Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is having to come out and point out that these kind of views are anathema. And I believe you're trying to stand for the Labour Party to become an MP in Brighton. If you do, and you make these comments, I'm guessing you'll have the whip withdrawn from you, but then again, UKIP's on the rise, they'll take you, the BNP, they might have something to say about your views.
This is what Mehdi Hasan always does.
By the way, just on a factual point, since we heard a lot about the second speaker, about how backward we Muslims all are, on a factual point, you said that Islam was born in Saudi Arabia. Islam was born in 610 AD. Saudi Arabia was born in 1932 AD. So you were only 1,322 years off. Not bad? Not bad start there.
Here Mehdi is just being sassy. He's picking up on technicalities of his opponent's arguments, which is something else that makes him a really entertaining debater.
Talking of maths, by the way, a man named Al-Khwarizmi was one of the greatest mathematicians of all time, a Muslim, worked in the golden age of Islam. He's the guy who came up with not just algebra, but algorithms. Without algorithms, you wouldn't have laptops. Without laptops, Daniel Johnson tonight wouldn't have been able to print out his speech in which he came to berate us Muslims for holding back the advance and intellectual achievements of the West, which all happened without any contribution from anyone else other than the Judeo-Christian people of Europe. In fact, Daniel David Levering, the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and author of The Golden Crucible, points out that there would be no Renaissance, there would be no Reformation in Europe without the role played by Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and some of the great Muslim theologians, philosophers, scientists in bringing Greek texts to Europe.
Mehdi here implies that Islam encourages the progress of science, not related to the motion in question, but addressing an opponent, and points to the man who invented algorithms. Great advancements in science were made by Muslim philosophers and scientists, but that's not to say Islam was responsible. In the same way, if you see a Muslim person drinking alcohol, that's not to say drinking is encouraged or even allowed in Islam. In fact, it's completely prohibited. When referring to Islamic teachings of the Quran and Hadith, Muslims are likely to say Islam encourages inquiry with verses such as, "Say, O Muhammad, travel through the land and observe how he began creation." Another example, say, "Observe what is in the heavens and the earth." But at the same time, there are verses that outright tell you not to question too much. For example, "O you who have believed, do not ask about things which if they are shown to you will distress you." Or in one hadith, "Allah has hated for you three things: vain talks, wasting of wealth, and asking too many questions in disputed religious matters." In practice though, what do we find? Often being a devout Muslim leads to a complete decline in reason, as well as obedience to dogma, especially in certain areas, which is most evident in fields such as evolutionary biology, cosmology, and theology. This happens because Islam teaches that the Quran is the perfect word of a perfect God, and that the Prophet Muhammad is the final and perfect messenger. For Muslims, this means that no questioning of the Quran's accuracy or morality is allowed. Revelation is favored over reason. To call into question a part of the Quran is to call into question the whole of the Quran, as well as its author, God. Secondly, it allows no criticism of the Prophet's actions, especially in a moral context. This means any refutation or disagreement of the Quran or Hadith is not seen as healthy skepticism, but as blasphemy or outright apostasy, the punishment for apostasy being death. This is fundamentally at odds with the spirit of science, where nothing is beyond criticism. This creates an environment where genuine open-ended questioning and criticism, which is the lifeblood of science and philosophy, is discouraged or outright suppressed. In fact, Islam does allow questioning, as long as you get to the correct answer, Islam's answer. How can Islam possibly claim to encourage free inquiry, when this very inquiry can lead you to blasphemy and apostasy, the punishment being death under Islamic law? Islam is also completely opposed to the scientific method, since most claims are completely unfalsifiable, from its foundations, such as the existence of God, heaven and hell, to other things such as the Prophet's splitting of the moon, the splitting of the sea, and so on. As a result of these unfalsifiable claims that are dictated to be true, outright false and pseudoscientific claims become interwoven into the official creed which direct believers' actions. To quote Friedrich Hayek on the topic of totalitarian propaganda, although it translates perfectly here, the word truth itself ceases to have its old meaning. It describes no longer something to be found. Truth becomes something to be laid down by authority. Then again, Mehdi was just refuting his opponent and didn't explicitly say Islam encourages scientific progress. So we'll give him the benefit of the doubt here.
As for this being our university, I will leave that to the imagination as to who is our and who is there. I studied here too. An astonishing set of speeches so far making this case tonight. A mixture of just cherry-picked quotes, facts and figures, self-serving, selective, a farrago of distortions, misrepresentations, misinterpretations, misquotations. Daniel talked about my article in the New Statesman, which got me a lot of flack, where I talked about the antisemitism that is prevalent in some parts of the Muslim community, which indeed it is. Of course, I didn't say in that piece that it was caused by the religion of Islam. In fact, modern antisemitism in the Middle East was imported from, finish the sentence, Judeo-Christian Europe, where I believe some certainly bad things happened to the Jewish people. In fact, Tom Friedman, Jewish-American columnist in the New York Times, told me in this very chamber last week that he believed, had Muslims been running Europe in the 1940s, 6 million extra Jews would still be alive today. So I'm not going to take lessons in anti-Semitism from someone who's here to defend the Judeo-Christian values of a continent that murdered 6 million Jews. Moving swiftly on. Yes.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm about to make that point. No, I'm about to make that point. You're right. I agree with you 110%. That is my point. I don't think Europe is evil or bad. I'm a very proud European. I don't want to judge Europe on that basis, but if we're going to play this gutter game where we pull out the Bali bombing and we pull out examples of anti-Semitism in the Islamic community, then of course I'm going to come back and say, well, hold on. I mean, look, let's be very clear. Daniel here was a last-minute replacement for Douglas Murray, who had to pull out. And Douglas and I have a well-documented differences, but to be fair to Douglas, as to be fair to Anne-Marie and to Peter, atheists. Atheists see all religions as evil, violent, threatening. What the problem I have with Daniel's speech is that Daniel comes here to run this robust defense of Christianity, forgetting that his fellow Christians, people who said they were acting in the name of Jesus, gave us the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, the anti-Jewish pogroms, European colonialism in Africa and Asia, the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, not to mention countless arson and bomb attacks on abortion clinics in the United States of America to this very day. I would like a little bit of humility from Daniel first before he begins lecturing other communities and other faiths on violence, terror, and intolerance. But, no thank you.
Mehdi says here that modern anti-Semitism in the Middle East has been imported from Judeo-Christian Europe. While it's true that Christian history is rife with anti-Semitism, Mehdi cannot claim that anti-Semitism was purely imported from Europe, vindicating Islam. Islamic texts have plenty to say about Jews. For example, you will surely find the most bitter towards the believers to be the Jews and polytheists. The last hour will not come unless the Muslims will fight against the Jews and the Muslims would kill them. We have cast hostility and hatred among them until the day of resurrection. In fact, these last two were in Hamas's covenant in 1988. Anti-Semitism in Muslim communities is often heightened by the conflict in the Middle East, but that doesn't mean it's purely political, because Islamic texts are anti-Semitic.
Take some water. But I would say this, to address the gentleman's very valid point here, I'm not going to play that game. I don't actually believe that Christianity is a religion of violence and hate because of what the LRA does in Uganda, or what Crusaders did to Jews and Muslims in Jerusalem when they took back the city in the 12th or 13th or whatever century it was. I believe that Christianity, like Islam, like pretty much every mainstream religion, is based on love and compassion and faith. I do follow a religion in which 113 out of the 114 chapters of the Quran begins by introducing the God of Islam as a God of mercy and compassion. I would not have it any other way. I don't follow a religion which introduces my God to me as a God of war, as some kind of Greek God of wrath, as a God of hate and injustice. Not at all. As Adam pointed out, you go through the Quran and you see the mercy and the love and the justice. And yes, you have verses that refer to warfare and violence. Of course it does. This is not a motion about pacifism. I'm not here to argue that Islam is a pacifistic faith. It is not. Islam allows military action, violence in certain limited contexts. And yes, a minority of Muslims do take it out of that context.
The ones that are supposedly taken out of context are quotes such as, "Kill the polytheists wherever you find them," "Fight those who do not believe in Allah on the last day," "O Prophet, struggle against the disbelievers and the hypocrites and be firm with them. I have been ordered by Allah to fight against the people until they testify." So let's take a look at some teachings that are rather black and white. The unmarried woman and man found guilty of sexual intercourse, lash each of them with 100 lashes. Allah's messenger awarded the punishment of stoning to death to the married adulterer and adulteress. As to the thief, cut off their hands. Whoever changes his religion, kill him. If these punishments are enforced, as they should be under Islamic law, could it be argued that it's a distorted interpretation of the Quran, or is it a literal one? These are not taken out of context. Another quote from the Hadith say that those who are to be sent to hell is 99 from every 100. Introducing God as merciful and compassionate with a plethora of verses that are as violent as this is meaningless. It's like saying Ted Bundy wasn't violent. How many people did he meet who he didn't kill? Osama bin Laden wasn't a terrorist. How many buildings did he not blow up?
But is it religious? Well, we talked about Woolwich. Daniel and Anne-Marie have suggested that it's definitely religion that's behind all of this. Well, actually, what I find so amusing tonight is we're having a debate about Islam, and the opposition tonight have come forward. We have a graduate in law, a graduate in modern history, a graduate in chemistry, and you know, I admire all of their intellects and their abilities, but we don't have anyone who's actually an expert on Islam, a scholar of Islam, a historian of Islam, a speaker of Arabic, even a terrorism expert or a security expert or a pollster, let alone to talk about what Muslims believe or think. Instead, we have people coming here, putting forward these views, putting forward these sweeping opinions.
Mehdi criticizes his opponents as none of them are experts on Islam, yet they come forward with sweeping statements. This is nothing to do with the motion, but it's a very dangerous attitude. Should only experts be allowed to openly criticize something? Do you have to be an expert on Islam, a scholar, a historian, a speaker of Arabic, a terrorism or security expert, or a pollster? Do you need a theology degree or to go to Islamic school for years just to point out the flaws within Islam? This attitude that only experts should be allowed to publicly criticize something is born from obedience to dogma and blind faith. Often it's being a devout Muslim that creates this kind of attitude in the very first place.
Listen to Professor Robert Pape of the University of Chicago, one of America's leading terrorism experts, who, unlike our esteemed opposition tonight, studied every single case of suicide terrorism between 1980 and 2005, 315 cases in total. And he concluded, and I quote, "There is little connection between suicide terrorism and Islamic fundamentalism or any of the world's religions. Rather, what nearly all suicide terrorist attacks have in common is a specific secular and strategic goal to compel modern democracies to withdraw military forces from territory that the terrorists consider to be their homeland."
Whilst that may have been an accurate study for the time, it doesn't seem to be the case anymore. This was a study published in 2022 that sought to determine whether Islam is epiphenomenal, correlated, or causal. And to quote from the study, "Our overall analysis suggests that Islam is more than epiphenomenal, but less than causal. The overall analysis suggests that Islam is positively associated with suicide attacks. There was a strong correlation between Islam and suicide terrorism, even to my surprise. Now I stress this isn't the terrorism we think about in the West, but this is mostly suicide bombings in the Middle East, where it seemed to be that both the perpetrators and the victims were both Muslim, the only difference being their Islamic sect and school of thought. This is just another indicator of how dogmatic Islam is. Not only do extremists kill non-Muslims, they kill other Muslims from other sects and schools of thought because they're in disagreement of the specific interpretation of the Quran or Hadith. Now, despite the study being controlled for foreign occupation as well as economic factors, I still believe we shouldn't take it too seriously. But it does beg the question, why do some extremists turn to suicide terrorism or terrorism in general? Firstly, Islam should spread and prevail over all other religions. It is He who sent His messenger with guidance and the religion of truth to make it prevail over all other religions. Secondly, striving in the cause of Islam is obligatory for all Muslims. It is that you believe in Allah and His messenger and strive in the cause of Allah with your wealth and your lives. Fighting has been made obligatory upon you, though you dislike it. He who dies without having fought in the way of Allah, or without having thought of doing so, dies in a branch of hypocrisy. And who are the enemies of Islam? It's those who have waged war against it. But by this definition, most people have waged war against Islam. Those who are from different Islamic sects and schools of thought are spreading their version of Islam have waged war against Islam because they are spreading the wrong version. And given the long history of conflict between the West and Islam, almost any act of violence can now be construed as an action in defense of the faith against Western powers who have waged war against Allah and His messenger. This, as well as the fact that God promises a whole host of bounties in paradise for the martyr. This is further worsened by the Islamic division of the world. In classical Islamic law, there are two major divisions of the world, which are Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, denoting regions where Islamic law governs the state, and everywhere else, the Dar al-Harb, which means House of War. Muslims are required to spread Sharia law and sovereignty through the Dar al-Harb. Now, at first, this should be attempted peacefully, but in the case that they refuse, it should be done forcefully. This division is not directly from the Quran or Hadith, but rather it comes from an Islamic scholar, but not any old scholar, a scholar from the 8th century named Abu Hanifa, the scholar who the biggest school of thought in the largest sect is named after. If this was the interpretation of the Quran and Hadith from one of the, if not the most influential scholar in Islamic history, who can possibly assert Islam is a religion of peace? Unsurprisingly, most Islamic scholars today argue that these divisions are no longer relevant. Now, as you can see with these verses, if you believe in the literal word of God and the Prophet, it doesn't look too ludicrous for Islamists to wage war on those they consider impede the spread of Islam.
And the irony is, when we talk about terrorism, the irony is that the opposition and the Muslim terrorists, the Al-Qaeda types, actually have one thing in common, because they both believe that Islam is a warlike, violent religion. They both agree on that. They have everything in common. Osama bin Laden would be nodding along to everything he's heard tonight from the opposition side. He agrees with them. The problem is that mainstream Muslims don't. The majority of Muslims around the world don't. In fact, a gentleman here started quoting all sorts of polls. Gallup carried out the biggest poll of Muslims around the world of 50,000 Muslims in 35 countries. 93% of Muslims rejected 9/11 and suicide attacks. And of the 7% who didn't, they all, when polled and focus grouped, cited political reasons for their support for violence, not religious reasons.
I shall address this point in detail in a second.
And as for Islamic scholars and what they say, well, Daniel talks about our University of Oxford. We'll go down to Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies, get hold of a man named Sheikh Afifi al-Akiti, who is a massively well-credentialed and well-respected Islamic scholar who has studied across the world, who in the days after 7/7 published a fatwa denouncing terrorism in the name of Islam, calling for the protection of all non-combatants at all times and describing suicide bombings as an innovation with no basis in Islamic law. Go and listen to Sheikh Tahir al-Qadri, one of Pakistan's most famous Islamic scholars, who published a 600-page fatwa condemning the killing of all innocents and all suicide bombings unconditionally without any ifs or buts. There's nothing new here. This is mainstream Islam, mainstream scholarship, which has said this for years. You don't go out and kill people willy-nilly in the high street or anywhere else on a bus or a mall based on verses of the Quran that you cherry-pick without any context, any understanding, any interpretation, or any commentary.
Point of information.
Please.
Well,
Well,
it doesn't happen apparently.
I didn't say it doesn't happen at all. I never said it didn't happen. I don't blame Islam. Yes, it's a very good point. And a lot of us are campaigning against that. And we're campaigning against it in the name of Islam. We're campaigning against it in the name of various interpretations of Islam. Anne-Marie comes and scares us with her talk of Sharia law. I would like to see the book of Sharia law. It doesn't exist. People argue over what Sharia law is. And you empower the extremists by saying there is only one version. You empower them all. I don't believe you took any interruptions, Anne-Marie, so I think you should stay there for a moment.
Several countries.
Here's what we're dealing with. Here's what we're dealing with.
The purest or most orthodox form of Islam is one where an Islamic state governs society according to Islamic law, or Sharia. Sharia is a set of laws based on the teachings of Islam as outlined in the Quran and Hadith. And because there are different interpretations of the Quran and Hadith, no single version of Sharia law exists. Because of this, Mehdi here implies that the problems faced by countries that enforce Sharia law can't be attributed to Islam, as Sharia law is open to interpretation, so different countries enforce different laws to different degrees. But as we have seen, even the teachings that are rather black and white are very violent. Islam is responsible for these because it outright commands that they are followed. A state that doesn't lash unmarried adulterers or that doesn't stone to death married adulterers are going against the teachings of Islam. When following Islamic teachings, violence is institutionalized. You may ask, do Muslim countries have to operate under Sharia? Because some countries don't strictly enforce these rules. The question itself points to the obvious fact that the further we move away from Islam and its teachings, the more humane, peaceful, and free entire states, societies, communities, and individuals become. Earlier, Mehdi mentioned mainstream Islam. Here it's important to note today that there are roughly 2.2 billion Muslims in the world. Out of those 2.2 billion, 1.5 billion currently live under blasphemy or apostasy laws. Now this is mainstream Islam. They are practiced to a greater or lesser degree, but that's not to say that they are completely obsolete, as we can see in cases such as Pakistan and Saudi Arabia.
We are dealing, I took your point. Here we are dealing with a 1400-year-old global religion followed by 1.6 billion people in every corner of the world, a quarter of humanity, of all backgrounds, cultures, ethnicities. And yet the opposition tonight wants to generalize, stereotype, smear in order to desperately win this debate. And here's my question, if we're going to generalize and smear. If, okay, people say yesterday's bombers, and we've got to be careful, there's a trial going on, were yesterday's attackers, motivated by Islam? Big debate. I don't believe they were. Let's say they were. Let's say Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, was motivated by Islam. Let's assume, for sake of argument, that Richard Reeves, the shoe bomber, was motivated by Islam. If Islam is responsible for these killings, if Islam is what is motivating these people, and Islam is therefore not a religion of peace, a religion of war, then ask yourself this question: why aren't the rest of us doing it? Why is it such a tiny minority of Muslims are interpreting their religion in the way that the opposition claim they are? Let's assume there are 16,000 suicide bombers in the world. There aren't. Let's assume there are for the sake of argument. That's 0.001% of the Muslim population globally. What about the other 99.99% of Muslims who the opposition tonight either ignore or smear? The reality is that the rest of us aren't blowing ourselves up tonight. The reality is that the opposition came here tonight not worried about the fact that me and Adam might pull open our jackets and blow ourselves up tonight because we're followers of a warlike warrior religion which wants to take over Europe and Daniel's university. The issue is this. The issue is this. Unless the opposition can tell us tonight, and Peter Atkins is here, one of our great atheist intellectuals, can tell us tonight, they can answer this question tonight, why don't the vast majority of Muslims around the world behave as violently and aggressively as a tiny minority of politically motivated extremists? Then they might as well give up and stop pretending they have anything relevant to say about Islam or Muslims as a whole.
Why aren't most Muslims blowing themselves up? Here we get to the crux of the problem. Firstly, I believe nobody in this entire debate addressed the motion appropriately. What nearly everyone addressed was the motion that Muslims are a peaceful people, rather than the motion Islam is a religion of peace. Human behavior is influenced by an entire cocktail of culture, family upbringing, societal norms, socio-economic class, and other things, as well as religion. They were potentially distracted by the fact that the debate was held a day after the murder of Lee Rigby by two Islamic extremists. But to determine whether Islam is a religion of peace, we should scour the Quran and the Hadith, the most authentic sources of information on Islam. And yes, there are many peaceful verses, however there are also a multitude of violent ones too. Firstly, I believe this is because morals are guided by a whole host of things. If Muslims all around the world truly live by the book, even ignoring the verses that are open to interpretation, Muslims would not be free mixing, that is, a group of male and female friends. They would not be listening to music. Women would need male chaperones to leave the house for prolonged periods of time. And Muslims would not be able to be alone in a room with someone of the opposite sex. In the West and in other more liberal countries, if all Muslims truly lived according to Islam's teachings, they would be entirely unable to integrate into modern society. Many Muslims, at least in the West, are moderate Muslims, but it's important to note the hypocrisy of religious moderation. To quote Sam Harris, religious moderation is a product of secular knowledge and scriptural ignorance. The texts themselves are unequivocal. They are perfect in all their parts. By their light, religious moderation appears to be nothing more than an unwillingness to fully submit to God's law. By failing to live by the letter of the texts, while tolerating the irrationality of those who do, religious moderates betray both faith and reason equally. Even in countries that do operate under Sharia, although they may have formal laws on apostasy and blasphemy, some countries do not widely enforce stoning, lashing and amputation, despite what the religion teaches. Again, the further you stray from Islam, the more peaceful and free things become. Using our modern sense of morality, we consciously or unconsciously pick and choose what we believe and how to live. In Islamic school when I was younger, they didn't teach me that the Prophet had sex slaves. They conveniently left that part out. Secondly, to quote Sam Harris again, Muslims living in the West generally appear tolerant of the beliefs of others. Let us accept this characterization for a moment, though it ignores the inconvenient reality that many Western countries now appear to be hotbeds of Islamic militancy. Before we chalk this up to Muslim tolerance, however, we should ask ourselves how Muslim intolerance would reveal itself in the West. What minority, even a radicalized one, isn't generally tolerant of the majority for most of its career? Even avowed terrorists and revolutionaries spend most of their days just biding their time. We should not mistake the tolerance of political, economic, and numerical weakness for genuine liberalism. Now, of course, I'm not saying that all Muslims are hidden terrorists, but there is no space for liberalism in Orthodox Islam. Muslims can still be a peaceful people despite the religion not being peaceful. But even here we encounter obstacles. In one survey of over 38,000 people, the survey included the following question posed only to Muslims. Some people think that suicide bombing and other forms of violence against civilian targets are justified in order to defend Islam from its enemies. Other people believe that no matter what the reason, this kind of violence is never justified. Do you personally feel that this kind of violence is often justified to defend Islam? Sometimes justified, rarely justified, or never justified? Here we see the results. Do you think you can really separate Islam from these attitudes? Even in the West, in a survey in 2016 conducted in the UK on British Muslims,
If you thought that someone who's close to you was getting...
When it came to exploring attitudes to violence, the survey asked British Muslims what actions they would take if they knew someone who was involved with supporting terrorism in Syria. Just 1/3, 34%, said they would report it to the police. There may be several reasons for not shopping would-be jihadists. One, of course, is that you might be sympathetic to their cause.
So no, most Muslims are not active terrorists, but a concerning amount are either neutral or sympathize with extremist regimes. Now you cannot doubt that Islam is at least in part responsible for these kinds of attitudes. A point that Mehdi doesn't touch on, although it was briefly mentioned by a member of the opposition, is the oppression of women in Muslim countries and communities. When we hear of peace or violence, we may not immediately think of women's rights, and our minds first go to acts of terrorism in New York, London, and Paris. However, the oppression of women is inherently tied to the notion Islam is a religion of peace. The unjust treatment of 50% of a population is not peaceful. Let's of course go to some real life statistics and then to the teachings of Islam. I'm sure you've heard it all before. Reading from this article, these challenges are particularly pronounced in the Muslim world, where approximately 65% of women are illiterate compared to 40% of men. The poverty rate is 31.6% among women, but 19% among men. The World Economic Forum's 2016 Global Gender Index reveals that fully 23 of the bottom 25 countries with the highest gender gaps are all Muslim countries. Again in Britain,
Let's read out some statements about the way women are treated in Britain.
Generational change might be expected to feature more strongly when it comes to the place of women in society. Of course, equal rights and status for men and women are now enshrined in British law. Yet 39%, 2/5 of British Muslims surveyed, say women should always obey their husbands, compared with only 5% of non-Muslim Britons.
now the vast majority of Muslims in the UK are from an immigrant background, so you can argue that culture plays an influence on British Muslims, and there's nothing inherent in the teachings of Islam that encourages the oppression of women. But again, this is far from true. Women in Islam inherit half of their brothers, their testimony is worth half, and there are many verses that do not advocate for equality. Allah commands you regarding your children, the share of the male will be twice that of the female. The Prophet said, isn't the witness of a woman equal to half that of a man? The woman said yes. He said, this is because of the deficiency of a woman's mind. Men are in charge of women by right of what Allah has given one over the other and what they spend for maintenance from their wealth. So righteous women are devoutly obedient, guarding in the husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed, and finally strike them. But if they obey you, seek no means against them. The Prophet said, I looked into paradise and found that the majority of its dwellers were the poor people. And I looked into the hellfire and found that the majority of its dwellers were women. Women are clearly not equals in Islam, and the treatment of women as second-class citizens is not merely a product of culture or socio-economics. The oppression of women is interwoven into its core texts. Now, if we are to take the approach of the other debaters and look at the actions of Muslims to determine whether Islam is a religion of peace, let's take a look at the actions of those who knew the Prophet most intimately. After the Prophet's death, leadership passed to what is known as the Rashidun Caliphate, a period ruled by 4 caliphs who were not only the earliest and most devout Muslims, but they were also the Prophet's closest companions. Abu Bakr was his closest friend and father-in-law. Umar was also a trusted advisor and father-in-law. Uthman, a wealthy early convert, married 2 of Muhammad's daughters. Ali, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, was raised in the household and was among the first to accept Islam. All 4 were deeply involved in the early Muslim community and were trusted companions, playing key roles during the Prophet's life and after his death. They weren't just his political successors, they were men who knew Muhammad personally, lived alongside him and fought beside him, and learnt directly from his teachings. If anyone could be expected to embody the true spirit of Islam, it would be them. And when we look to the historical record, we find that this period, held by Sunni Muslims as the golden age of Islamic governance, we find it was marked by rapid and large-scale military expansion. Within just a few decades, the Islamic Empire extended far beyond the Arabian Peninsula, conquering vast regions of the Byzantine and Sasanian empires. The conquests weren't isolated skirmishes or purely defensive reactions. The scale, coordination, and ambition behind these campaigns clearly reflect a calculated empire-building project. If the Prophet's closest followers, those who knew him the best and were entrusted with carrying out his vision, oversaw an era defined by military conquest and expansion, what does this tell us about the nature of the ideology? Whilst it's true that historical context, politics, and regional dynamics played a role, it becomes harder to maintain the idea that Islam, in its original form, was strictly a non-aggressive or purely defensive faith. The Rashidun Caliphate gives credence to the saying, Islam was spread by the sword. Now let's quickly look at Islam and education. And to quote Sam Harris for the very last time, we should not be led to believe that poverty and lack of education are the roots of the problem, that a generation of poor and illiterate children are being fed into the fundamentalist machinery of the madrasas should surely terrify us. But Muslim terrorists have not tended to come from the ranks of the uneducated poor. Many have been middle class, educated, and without any obvious dysfunction in their personal lives. Compared with the 9/11 hijackers, John Walker Linth, a young man from California who joined the Taliban, was distinctly undereducated. Ahmed Omar Sheikh, who organized the kidnapping and murder of the Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl, studied at the London School of Economics. Hezbollah militants who die in violent operations are actually less likely to come from poor homes than their non-militant contemporaries and more likely to have a secondary school education. The leaders of Hamas are all college graduates and some have master's degrees. Now onto the topic of cherry-picking verses and teachings of the Quran, since many were revealed in the context of war. But in the last 10 years of the Prophet's life, he was involved in over 80 military expeditions, defensive and aggressive battles. War is not the exception when it comes to Islam and the Prophet. It seems to be the norm. This leads us to something called abrogation in Islam, where earlier verses are superseded by later ones. And as the Prophet was involved with more and more battles, more and more teachings and verses approach the topic of violence and warfare, where many argue they supersede the peaceful verses. So when reading the Quran in chronological order, rather than the order it's assembled in, it gets more and more violent. The violence being advocated in the later verses, abrogating the earlier ones, is a literal interpretation, and it's not a difficult interpretation to get to. And this is the exact reason one extremist gave for his motivations after being arrested for the planning of several terrorist attacks in London. The Quran is encrypted, and if you read it in chronological order, you'll find that the majority of the peaceful verses have been cancelled out by the later verses commanding violence. Now say this is all one massive misunderstanding. Every single multitude of the violent verses are justified in one sense or another. If these interpretations are all false, there is still the issue that a literal reading of the Quran is so violent. Should it require scholars who study the religion for years or Muslim Oxford professors to unravel the truth of peace behind Islam's teachings? And with many verses, Muslim apologists come equipped with vast proofs of Islam's supposed innocence. At almost every single turn, we have to give the Quran and the Hadith the benefit of the doubt. Is this not a clear indication of the underlying nature of this ideology? Thank you for watching.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me just say this to you. Think about what the opposite of this motion is. If you vote no tonight, think about what you're saying the opposite of this motion is. That Islam isn't a religion of peace.